now, without further ado, I am so excited to once again introduce Dr. Michael Miller. Dr. Michael S. Miller is an associate professor of economics and associate dean for quality and compliance at DePaul University, where he's been teaching since completing his PhD in 1980 at the University of Pittsburgh. His expertise is in applied macroeconomics and business conditions analysis. In addition to teaching macroeconomics and pursuing research on the economy of Bahrain, Dr. Miller spent 17 years in administration, serving as department chairman and associate dean. He's twice been the recipient of DePaul's University's Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Miller has taught overseas as well, including time in Hong Kong, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Bahrain. He's a regular guest on Chicago radio and television, providing insights on macroeconomic conditions, fiscal policy, and the Federal Reserve's monetary decisions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Miller.
Well, thank you. Let's get started here. I'm going to share my screen. I have some prepared slides that I'm going to go through with you. And then when it's all over, we will then have a time for questions and answers. So let's see here. There we go. Up. Let's try that again. Slide number 1. There we are. So I have titled this particular presentation, The Post-Pandemic Economy, which is what I'm going to be discussing. But of course, I'm going to have to look at what was existing right before. And I want to know and discuss with you whether there's going to be some kind of a new normal. I've heard a lot of talk about that expression, and people want to know, are things going to be different going forward than they were before the pandemic? And I think we're going to find for a couple things the answer is yes, and for a couple things the answer is no. So my agenda for today is to overview the economic data during the pandemic to give you an idea of where we started, how bad it got, and where it is now that the economy has rebounded quite fabulously, but we're not back to where we were before. I'm going to talk about which facets of the economy will remain at what we would call, I'm making up this as the old normal. And then we're going to take a look at what might be some facets of the economy which will have a new normal. We're also going to examine the policy response from the federal government in the form of fiscal policy. And we're going to look at what the central bank did in terms of monetary policy, and maybe think about what they are going to look like going forward, as well as where they are right now. And then, of course, we'll have the Q&A session. So to set the table so that we understand where we are in relation to that pandemic and why the post-pandemic may or may not have new normals, let's take a look at the month or so right before the pandemic began, which would take us to early March, when we knew that there was a disease out there. We weren't so sure it was going to spread as quickly as it ended up spreading, and we did not know at the time that the response to this would be shutdowns. So as early March 2020, macroeconomists would argue that the economy was in what we would call a long-run equilibrium, and this would be an ideal situation. So what did we have? We had full employment. The unemployment rate was a staggeringly low 3.5%, the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. The gross domestic product was not only at a level of GDP which was necessary to create this full employment level, but it was growing at what we would call its long-run potential growth rate of 2%. In other words, the economy was not overheating and it was not subpar. It was pretty much exactly where you would want the economy to be. Inflation was at or below the Fed's target. Actually, we're going to talk about inflation towards the end because it is an issue that even was important in today's release of the Consumer Price Index. The rate of inflation has been at or below the Fed's target. And in fact, because it has been below the Fed's target for actually years, going forward, there's going to be kind of a new normal when it comes to how the Fed reacts to that target rate. But inflation was not an issue right before the pandemic began. And here's the other thing was really kind of sweet. You want to make sure that an economy is growing at a rate so that anybody who wants to enter the labor market has a very good chance of getting a job. So payroll job creation has to do with where jobs are, where you work for somebody else. And you want to know, are there sufficient jobs being created to absorb all new labor market entrants, whether they be out of high school, turning 16, retirees who change their mind about wanting to be retired? Can we absorb all these people? It turned out that the payroll jobs were growing at a rate sufficient to keep unemployment between, say, 3.5 and 3.7. In other words, they were growing at exactly the right rate. And then we would always want to know, are there any imbalances in the economy? Are there any sectors where there's a demand much greater than supply, or the other way around? And what was cool is that the inventories were all in a line. There were no imbalances. There were no major problems in the economy. So it's hard to believe that just a little over a year ago, we were sitting at the sweetest spot for the American economy, maybe in 20 years, maybe for even longer than that. And then, of course, the Fed and the government, because we were doing so well, they had put into position some target policies that they thought would be ideal for where we were doing. So what the Fed had done coming into March of 2020 was to create a neutral stance for monetary policy. In other words, to try to have a level of interest rates which neither enticed you to spend more or stopped you from spending more. It would be a neutral stance. You will make the decision purely based upon your desires, not on the interest rate. The government was running a deficit, as it has for almost all years since 1945. And the deficit was supposed to be $1 trillion. Now, that's a lot of money, we know. But what you would always do is you compare it to the size of gross domestic product. And we find that this was very much in line with what we would say the target rate of keeping the government's budget deficit below, say, 2 or 3% of GDP. And if you can certainly keep it below the growth rate of the economy in nominal terms, including inflation, then we know that the debt as a proportion of GDP would actually fall, not rise. So the deficit was large in absolute dollars, but it was a manageably large number. And as of early March, before we knew how bad the pandemic was going to be, all reputable forecasters, including the Federal Reserve, had come to the conclusion that the economy was going to grow throughout 2020. And by the time we got to March, we were already in the longest expansion in the history of the United States. And we thought, okay, there could be a downturn maybe in 2021, but 2020, we should have continuous economic growth, and this would make it by far the longest expansion we have ever had. And then the pandemic hit, and we had what I can only say would be a unique recession. And the reason I say it's a unique recession is recessions are generally tied to changes in confidence, imbalances in inventories, shocks in some kind of monetary policy. And when all of these various things would come together, you would see a downturn in the consumption of durable goods like cars, furniture, appliances. You'd see a cut in inventory levels by corporations, and maybe a cut in home construction and so forth. And all these different things then would lead to the recession. None of these were the cause of the recession. There was one cause and one cause alone. In mid-March, both the United States government, state governments, and local governments essentially told people to stop shopping, to stop spending, for businesses to stop producing, and for workers to stay home. And this was an event which has no precedent in American history. We have never done this before. During the war, during the polio pandemic, during the Great Depression, never did we have a situation where the federal government essentially asked the economy to stop. It was uniquely damaging then to a sector that is not normally one that takes it on the chin during recessions. Like I say, normally a recession is rooted in durable goods like cars, appliances, and furniture. This one was rooted squarely in the service sector and things like leisure and hospitality. We're going to look at some data during the pandemic that make this perfectly clear. So the economy went into the pandemic. We shut everything down people became afraid, and that fear is what, in fact, was at the root of much of the decline in GDP, and the time it has taken to recover is related to the fear people had about going out and getting the disease. But what was interesting about this particular period, now we're going to look at what happened as the pandemic progressed to get us where we are today. When it comes to, say, a gross domestic product falling, we had a decline in gross domestic product, total output of goods and services measured in dollars. It was the greatest decline ever by a magnitude of several. I mean, no time in history had we had anything quite like it. But we had a recovery which was unlike the most recent recoveries. We had what is called a V-shaped recovery. Now, here's some things. We have some data on what happened, and I want to show you that V-shaped recovery. So unemployment at the start of the pandemic, 3.5%. At peak, 14.8, and it's currently 6.1. So the increase from 3.5 to 14.8 is the greatest increase since the Great Depression. The decline is quite substantial. However, we want to keep in mind that 6.1% compared to 3.5% means that the economy is still pretty far from being back to normal, to being back where it was. And this is why you look at the Fed and they say, we're just not quite there yet. We're making really good progress. Now, we're going to find the same thing with inflation. That's not it. Well, actually, we're going to save inflation. I'm going to talk about that later. If we look at inflation, it was 1.8% before the pandemic. It is currently 4.3 using what is called the PCE core index. We'll talk about that. So like I say, I'm going to leave inflation to a moment from now. Total unemployed. At the start of this pandemic, 5.7 million Americans were out of work. It peaked at 23.1, an absolutely stunning number. And when we saw that extreme number, we thought, oh my gosh, it will take years for us to recover. Well, we're not all the ways back. We still have almost 10 million people out of work. And this is, again, why the Fed is not going to all of a sudden stomp on the brake pedal and try to slow the economy down, because we're still not back there. There's still a lot of Americans who are out of work, 9.8 million. So it's still roughly 4 million people more than at the start of the recession, the pandemic. And you got to recognize that being at 9.8 would be the depths of a bad recession. So we're making progress. We're moving in the right direction. But boy, we still have some while to go. And then payroll jobs. Now, this is where you work for someone else. This ignores the self-employed, and it ignores those who work on farms. Farmers and the self-employed are excluded. So this is people who work for someone else. The total number of jobs that existed in March was 152.5 million. The bottom was 130. Look, that number, again, is a stunning number. That's a drop of almost 20 million. No, more than 22 million jobs. Now, we've come way back. We've come back to 144 million, but you see, we're not quite back to where we started. Now, this one I'm putting in, remember, the stock market is not the economy, but it may be of interest to you. I added this just yesterday as people are probably going to think about what happened to the stock market. And I'm going to pick a broad index, so we're not looking at some particular item like a sector or something, or spiders or whatever. So the S&P 500, the weekly average was 3366. The S&P fell a stunning 34% in 1 month. I looked at the graph on Fed and I said, Fred, and said, where's the bottom of the market? And it took 1 month to fall 34%. But since the 3366, in other words, above the pre-pandemic level, we're already up 25%. So if you take it from the bottom, from the 34% decline, it's up by even more. But what we care about, where were we when this all started? 3366. We're now 25% above that. That is also something that a lot of people like to talk about. Is this justified by the condition of the economy? And then it turns out that the interest rate on, say, 10-year treasuries, which are very important in terms of funding for the government, as well as the mortgage market, they were 1.6. and they currently sit at 1.6. I see just this morning it ticked up to about 1.67, 7 basis point increase. And this is tied to people's concerns about inflation. Now, here's the gross domestic product. And you can see here, now this is measured in dollars, and you can see the shape of the collapse in GDP and its current recovery. And what you see is a V-shaped recovery. A lot of times GDP would kind of come out of it, and it would bounce along the bottom for a while, and then it would rise and then maybe slow down its rise and then speed up and so forth. No, this is the ultimate expression of a V-shaped recovery. And if you look at the total dollar value of GDP, this is the one aspect of the economy where the recovery from the pandemic has been almost complete. When this number came out for the end of March, January, February, March, the first quarter, we were within 1% of the size of GDP in the first quarter of 2020. And this means essentially, because we've had a pretty good month since then, I think it is safe to say that the United States has passed its previous peak. In other words, when it comes to GDP, we're done. The pandemic effect upon GDP is over. Now, that's not true with the labor market. Unemployment and number of jobs still have a fairly good way to go. But when it comes to GDP in and of itself, the pandemic is behind us. Now, we can also look at growth rates. And what's fascinating about the growth rates, if you see the numbers, the little bars on the left-hand side of the graph, they barely seem to be moving. But, here's the problem. In a normal table like this, when we would show the growth rate of GDP, the very top of the graph would be maybe 7%. But because of the collapse in the economy, so if we look here, we see that the number is around a minus 30. It was minus 33% essentially at an annualized rate. This graph will be changed forever in that we have to have numbers so stunningly out of the ordinary just to represent what happened during the pandemic. And we see that this little decline here in the first quarter of 2020, that decline, understand that as of the beginning of March or the first week of March, that was an increase of several percent. So the entire decline that you see in GDP in that first quarter of 2020 was due to the last 3 weeks of March. It took it from a positive number to a negative number. That's how stunningly bad that portion of the economy was. And then we had that collapse in the second quarter. And then we had the V. And the V shape is, of course, now you have this enormous level of GDP here where the GDP grew at a 30-some% annual rate. And we still have these numbers here. You will see that the level of GDP growth rate here and here are higher than what we had before. So see, GDP is growing quite smartly. Now, a lot of this is tied to stimulation, which has been provided by the federal government and some things which have been done by the Federal Reserve. Now, when it comes to the labor market, we also have, in a sense, a V-shaped recovery, which makes it sound like labor is back. But when you look at it the way I've decided to do it, which is using an index number, and with an index number, we're looking at percentages. So we see here at 100. So in other words, if you look at the blue line, which is all employees, leisure and hospitality, this number down here, which is near 50, means that this is a nearly 50% decline in the total number of people employed in hospitality. That is not just a recession, that is an absolute collapse. And certainly there's no doubt that there is a V-shape. See, one of the things I was having trouble, how am I going to explain this? We have this V-shaped recovery here in, say, leisure and hospitality, which has now leveled off. But even to this day, we're still right here, and the number's 80. That means we're still 20% below the employment level that existed in March of 2020. That is a staggeringly bad number. Now, leisure and hospitality are coming back because people are going back out to restaurants. They're beginning to travel again, even to the point now that part of the increase in inflation in the month of April was due to a pretty substantial rise in the cost of airline tickets. Now, when you look at the other two, you see employment in manufacturing, which is the red line. You see that had the smallest drop, and it is back within 5% or so of where it was. So manufacturing was not very much hurt, which is unusual. A recession normally takes down durables. but this is one of the places where it took down the services sector, most notably leisure and hospitality. So workers are getting back to work, and the fact that we're not back to that 100%, in other words, we're still well below, especially in leisure and hospitality, this explains why the labor market is not quite as rosy in terms of its position now as the GDP is overall. We do have a large GDP, but some of that is due to money being provided, like I say, by the federal government. Now, let's take a look at some things about what's normal, what's not. And I'm going to reveal a couple of things here, and we'll try to decide. So the first one, what's the potential growth rate for the economy? In other words, before the pandemic occurred, the long run potential growth rate of the economy was about 2%. That's based upon an increase in the labor force of maybe 0.8 and an increase in productivity of, say, 1.2, with essentially no changes in the number of hours worked. There has been nothing that I could read that would make me think that that number going forward would be substantially higher or lower. So in my mind, the potential GDP post-pandemic does not have a new normal. It has the old normal. Now, the one thing that could raise potential GDP is if the labor force were to grow faster, and this would happen only through people deciding to go back to work or through, in a short run, some kind of change in immigration, that would raise the potential level. But I don't see either one of these necessarily occurring. So I would argue that there is no new normal with potential GDP. Now, this one, you might wonder why I picked these particular words. Now, and I hope this does not necessarily sound political, but it is in some sense tied to the politics of it. Pre-pandemic, we had a president whose major concern was economic growth. And I think that goes hand in hand, not only with that particular president, Mr. Trump, but with the Republican Party in general. Now we have Mr. Biden, who is our president, and we have the Democrats in charge of Congress. I think in my opinion, what has changed is in this post-pandemic period and going forward, at least for the next 4 years, the focus will be upon redistribution more so than economic growth. Now, I'm not sure that that policy choice will necessarily somehow change dramatically GDP's growth rate, but it certainly does change the mindset of the importance of entrepreneurship and growth in general. Now, no matter which party is in power, government likes to spend. So on the left-hand side, pre-pandemic, were people spending? Was the government spending and running large deficits? Yes, they were spending. What's going to happen going forward? They're going to spend. And all I need to do is to point to the commentaries by Mr. Biden on what his plans are for infrastructure and so forth. He would like to spend a lot of money for two reasons, because he would like to do these things because that's what society wants. And secondly, it would be good in terms of dealing with the problems from COVID and the pandemic. So there is no party that says, I don't want to spend, I want to be very frugal, and a party that says, I do want to spend. They both spend. It's just how dramatically large will be that spending. The same thing tied here then, the redistribution part versus growth. The former administration at the time of the pandemic start, they were very much into tax cuts. They were very controversial. Some people still do not like the fact that they were done and some of the side effects in terms of budget deficits and so forth. And Mr. Biden has made it perfectly clear that he would like to change tax structures for what he calls fair share, that there will be tax increases in capital gains and top rates of people in corporations and so forth. So his major focus is to increase taxes and then to use that money to fund the larger amount of spending. This is a change in philosophy, and I think that is one of the new normals that does matter. Inflation was around 2%, and the Federal Reserve has made clear that while they're, I'll talk to you in a moment here, that they're going to let inflation get a little higher than it was, it's still going to be around 2%. Inflation before the pandemic began, the Federal Reserve had what is called a inflation target, that the moment that inflation would hit 2%, they would begin to tap on the brakes to keep it from rising. Now they're doing what is called price level targeting, and that'll be the central point of my discussion. And then lastly, we have the Fed's balance sheet. The balance sheet of the Fed was large after the Great Recession, and It was trillions of dollars. They had tried to do something called tapering, and the months before the pandemic, of course, unrelated to the pandemic, the Fed stopped tapering because they thought it was beginning to slow the economy down. Well, the Fed did during the pandemic what it did during the Great Recession, and it increased its balance sheet enormously. And I'm going to show you some graphs. So I think the new normal is that we're going to go from a large Fed balance sheet to an enormous Fed balance sheet. And it could be years, many years before there's any reconciling of whether that's going to change or not. So what happened, of course, is the government, we had the fiscal policy response to the pandemic was a unique case because the government, in a sense, caused the recession and the downturn in the economy. So a lot of people from both sides, both political parties decided, even the inflation hawks decided that the government, in a sense, has to fix it. The government has to spend money to make people whole, to keep them from starving. And since they told them they can't go to work, they have to come up with the money to allow this to happen. And then, of course, the Fed had the same reaction to the pandemic as it had to the Great Recession. Now, let's take a little bit look at fiscal policy and get an idea of how it has changed and what it means, say, going forward. It was funded by essentially borrow and print. The government, when the government doesn't have any of its own money. It can only get money by taking it from others in the form of, say, taxation, or it can print the money, or it can borrow the money. And there is a combination where they borrow, and then the Federal Reserve helps them by printing. And of course, that is at least up until now, that is the direction that that has been chosen, the borrow and print. What happens is that the government will auction treasury bills on given Mondays. They'll auction these bills, notes, and bonds to the world market, and they will take these dollars that they have put out in these bonds and securities, and they will use that to do the spending that they want to do. And once those bonds and so forth are in the open market, that is when the Fed can step up and say, well, I will buy them, and I will print money as a means of buying them. And that's where we get into what I would call the print stage. So here's what we're going to take. We're going to take a look at some data on. Now, the deficit in dollars was unlike, as I say here at the top, unlike any other ever. And I hope that this is not going to be a new normal. I want to say I'm reasonably confident we will not be running 2.8 or 3.2 trillion dollar deficits going forward. I think it will. I'm hoping it will be much less onerous than this is. But you can see the important thing is to look here, going back to, say, 1995. Understand that this is 1995, and we're here with a couple hundred billion dollars of deficits. Now we're talking about $3.2 trillion. And even during the Great Recession, see, the worst during the Great Recession was about a $1.3 trillion deficit. And back then, people were pulling their hair out based upon such numbers. And we were making progress. You can see that as it's moving up, of course, that means the deficit's getting smaller. But then we kind of gave up. And that's why I said both parties spent. This is the latter part of, say, the Trump administration, where they're spending and they have the tax cuts, and then things really go bad. So I'm hoping that this line will begin to go back up towards smaller numbers, a smaller percentage of GDP. Well, that's the key. What is the deficit as a percent of GDP? And it is the greatest since World War II. So we thought, for example, if you look at the normal, you would want it to be somewhere smaller than 3%. There was an agreement when the euro was created called the Maastricht Treaty. And what the Maastricht Treaty talked about was that fiscal deficits should be no more than, say, 3% of nominal or current dollar gross domestic product. And we tried to keep it there, and every once in a while it would bump up. And, during the Great Recession, you don't care when the budget deficit gets very large, because you're helping to fight the recession. People don't pay as much in taxes, which of course would cause a deficit to rise, and you have to help them out. So this is not unusual. And then this increase you see as we move up here, as the economy was strengthened, this was very normal. But this drop to 15% of GDP, this is unprecedented. Nothing since the Great War, World War II, do we have numbers that come even close to that. I'm pretty sure that as the deficit gets smaller in absolute numbers of dollars, this percent of GDP will get smaller. And as GDP rises, of course, this will get smaller as well. Now, the debt itself, the total amount that if you look at all the bonds put out there by the federal government, how much do we owe as a government and so forth, we're talking about, well, keep your eye on the left side here. We're talking about 28 million, which of course this is in millions of dollars. So this is a $28 trillion deficit. And you can see that there is apparently no period where this actually did not rise. But keep in mind that as early as 2000, this is right at this down here in this corner is 2002. So this is the millennium. We were at about $6 trillion debt. Now we're at 28 trillion, and you can see this enormous increase here that has occurred, which is consistent with everything I've been telling you. Now, when I say it continues to soar and will never fall, I mean by that the level of the national debt will not get smaller because we never pay off a national debt, nor is there really any reason to do so. So that it's there for good. But what you want to look at is what is the debt as a percent of GDP. And even here, given how much debt has gone up, it is the greatest level since World War II. But as I mentioned here, this need not be forever. This need not be a new normal. What will happen is the deficit will rise. But if the deficit rises more slowly than the nominal economy does, in other words, the ability to produce goes up faster than the debt or the new debt, then the debt as a percent of GDP will fall. So there's no reason it has to stay here, but there's no indication from what I've seen in the forecasts, which are always quite poor anyhow, that this number is going to fall down below the 100% level. Some people concern themselves with that level right there of 100% of GDP because there is some evidence in other countries that when the national debt becomes 100% of GDP, overall economic growth tends to slow. I'd have to wait and see if there's any new research to see if that is still the case. All right, now let's take a look at the role of the Federal Reserve because they're the number one thing in town right now. You know that there's three considerations that the Federal Reserve has at any point going forward. They are mandated by law to try to keep inflation under control. They are mandated by law to foster maximum employment. These are the two. This is what is called the dual mandate, and it was part of some legislation of the 1970s, and it is what the Fed must do in terms of their monetary policy. They must try to keep inflation under control and foster employment. But there is another part to their charter that is I want to bring to your attention. That is, it is the job of the Fed to counter systemic risk. In other words, when the economy is about to just collapse before our eyes, there has to be somebody who can step in to try to do something to keep the economy from collapsing. Now, you would think the Treasury would be the one because it is a body of the government, and the Treasury can do certain things like borrowing money and spending it, of course. But it is the job of the Fed to try to keep the financial markets from collapsing, and that's why I'm saying about counter systemic risk by some kinds of regulations or deregulation, and then they become what is called the lender of last resort. When no one else will provide liquidity, the Federal Reserve is the one who would provide liquidity. Now, there are going to be several means through which they are going to deal with implementing this particular policy. And as with the Great Recession, one of them was interest rates. Short-term rates were lowered to the zero lower bound, as it is called. And that's what has happened now. We have interest rates essentially at zero. But you know what? Interest rates at zero are practically a non-issue for most people. If you can't buy something, it isn't because you can't borrow money cheaply enough. It has, however, I can't but help notice that the very low interest rates have fed a housing boom, unlike any other in the recent past. The only good thing about this housing boom is that we're not, as far as I know, giving out mortgages with 0% down and crazy things like that. The number of subprime mortgages is not rising. Lenders are being pretty stingy with the money, but people are coming out, they're finding the money to buy homes. So there is a housing boom in part because of these low interest rates. Now, I would expect based upon everything that Jay Powell and other members of the Federal Reserve Board have said, that these rates will remain at their zero lower bound until, and this is what they almost said explicitly, until the labor market returns to full employment. Now, that will be somewhere in their judgment around 4.5 to 5%. The only thing that could change this would be if there was a sudden spike in inflation, which was completely unprecedented. I don't foresee that, but of course, I will never say never. Now, even if interest rates are increased, I do not think they're going to go back to what I would call historical norms. I think we have a new normal, and that new normal has existed since 2009. If you look at the average federal funds effective rate, that's what banks pay each other to borrow money short run when they need to get their hands on money. Between 89 and 2009, in that 20-year period, the average cost of short run money was 4.33%. Since 2009, it's 0.55%. That is a huge difference. And this is true not just here, it's true across the world, in part because there is a glut of savings across the world, and growth rates across the world are relatively low. There has not been some kind of major technical breakthrough that has caused massive growth and massive increases in productivity, which would raise our potential GDP, which would then raise this cost of money in the short run. So I would think that even if and when the Fed begins to raise interest rates, they're not going to go back up to 4.33%. They're going to go up to maybe 2%. And so that will be a new normal compared to, say, the 20 years before the Great Recession. Now, liquidity is the other issue. Of course, the Fed wants to make sure that anybody who wants dollars can get their hands on those dollars. So how does the Fed do this? Well, they go into the market and they buy assets, and they take these assets and they pay for them by printing money. Now, the Fed at its most recent meeting has continued what it was doing before. Anytime a holding of the Fed matures, they reinvest the principal. So we don't have any kind of tapering caused by principal. But at the same time, the Fed has promised that they will go into the market on a monthly basis and buy $120 billion worth of securities. That's $80 billion worth of new treasuries and $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities. So this is the Fed providing liquidity to these particular markets. And when they buy the treasuries, they're buying treasuries at all different kinds of maturities to make sure that interest rates across the board remain in line with what they think is necessary to keep the economy going. Now, mortgage rates have continued to be historically low, even though we've had an increase in the treasury yields because they compete with each other, the 10-year treasury and mortgages. Mortgages have gone up, but they've been bouncing in levels that even with the increase that we had just recently, got up to about 3.375 or so for people with lots of money down and solid financial credentials. We still have mortgage rates which are historically low. And so if you have the money and the ability and the desire buying a house now, even at the current interest rates, the prices are going up, but getting the money is not necessarily the issue. Now, of course, I did mention that these dollars were created out of thin air. What the Fed does when it buys these securities, it simply goes to its keyboard. It types in a transit number and it transfers dollars, billions upon billions of dollars from thin air into the bank accounts of those who sold the securities to the Fed. So it is essentially a case of printing money out of thin air. And we call this a process. We've been doing that since 2009. We call it quantitative easing. And it has been historic. The amount has been quite historic. And so now we have these new balance sheet sizes. And this is what I think will be a new normal, the Fed having a balance sheet which is enormous. You can see here there was this period right here in the months before the end of 2019, the Fed began what is called tapering, where they were not reinvesting principal, which was allowing the size of their current asset base to their balance sheet to decline. And they saw the economy was kind of staggering a little bit. And they said, whoops, we're going to stop that. So you can see this little increase here that occurred. That's when the Fed said, we're going to stop the tapering. And then, of course, we have a massive, probably the largest amount in a short period of time ever And we have this continuing. This is the $120 billion per month. We see it increasing and increasing. It will until the Fed decides to change its mind. That number will keep going up, and the Fed currently owns almost $8 trillion worth of assets. Now, let's talk about the question of inflation. There's no doubt that inflation has risen. Here's what's interesting. The Fed has moved from what is called inflation targeting to price level targeting. Now, what this means is, in the past, when inflation, if they had a target rate for inflation of 2%, and the rate of inflation as reported by the PCE, that's Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, was above 2% for any length of time, say a quarter, the Fed would tap on the brakes to stop the inflation from getting worse, to bring it back down to that 2% level. Here's what's interesting. It doesn't matter where the inflation rate was before. So in other words, you could have 5 years where inflation was, let's say, 0. And the moment it hits, say, 2.5, we're going to tap on the brakes. But of course, there's been no increase in prices for 5 years. And the Fed decided, no, maybe that's not the best way to look at it. Maybe what we should be looking at is price levels. So in other words, if you have a long period where inflation is below 2%, that's still the target. There's no reason why you can't allow inflation to be above 2% for, say, a number of years, which, when the whole period is over, inflation will have averaged 2%, and the price level will have gone up by 2%. Now, it seems, I think, by reading what the Fed is doing, even though the CPI came out high today, the Fed is not going to tap on the brakes, because there's no reason why inflation could not be at, say, 3.5% or 2.5 to 3% for, say, the next 6 months, and still the price level would be very much under control within its 2% target. So, and there's something else the Fed is wondering. Is some of the inflation, is it temporary? In other words, it's because of some temporary increases in energy prices, some temporary increases due to, say, airlines, which of course had been very low and now they're starting to rise, and hotels now maybe it can begin to raise their rates a little bit, and there are supply chain problems. And so maybe we may have some inflation, say, for the next 6 months. Maybe it'll be 2.5 to 3%. But given the fact that it has been below 2% for 6 or 7 years, we certainly are not in price level trouble. And that's why the Fed then won't step on the brakes and raise interest rates until the labor market is doing better. Now, we do see that inflationary expectations, which is a very big worry of the Fed, for the short run, they are up. But when you look at the bond market and you look at surveys, it appears that the intermediate and long run, in other words, let's look at a year or more, there really is no belief in the minds of the bond market and others that inflation is going to be not only new and rising, but continuing to rise. It's though it's going to be some kind of a temporary phenomenon. I think there is something to be said for that particular view. Now, I just want to almost always add this particular slide. You know, going forward, we always got to remember this wonderful idea by a guy named Henry Hazlitt about economic policy making. And he refers to the art of economics, which of course, economics is a social science, but when you apply it to making policy, it is an art. Whenever you would come up with a policy, it is not enough to look at the short run. You must also look at the long run, but you can't ignore the short run. In other words, time matters. You must look at both the short run and the long run effects of your policy. And secondly, you must always look at the consequences, not just for those who are aided by a policy, but by those who could be hurt, and those who could be hurt no matter where they are. So in other words, he says, tracing the consequences of a policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. And so I think that I'm hoping that Mr. Biden and his economics team, that the Federal Reserve and their economics team will take it to heart that they must look at short run, long run, and all groups when making their economic policies. So let's take some time for Q&A, but I just wanted to say, if you wanted to contact me about this presentation, I'm available at mmiller@depaul.edu, and I would just ask that what you would do is put in the subject line, it would be the alumni presentation or something like that, and I'll know why it is you're contacting me, and I can provide you answers to your questions or the slides or whatever you would like. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow us then to go to questions. So Emily, you take it.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some great questions here. We can get it started with one that was submitted in advance of the event. You talked a little bit about the service industry and the effects of unemployment in the service industry, but
Yes.
what would you say people can expect, or what advice would you have for tourism-dependent economies moving forward?
Well, the question would become, are people going to stop? Is there going to be a new normal for travel and for leisure? And I believe the answer is no. There was some good research I saw at the National Bureau of Economic Research. They put out working papers, and this paper made it clear that the thing that was keeping leisure and hospitality down was fear of getting the disease. And now that we have vaccinations, now we know, for example, that masks outdoors do no good. I mean, you can be outdoors and you're perfectly safe in terms of casual contact, that people will become much, much less afraid. We already are seeing the number of flights. I actually I flew out to see my son in Washington State a week and a half ago, and the plane was much fuller than it was when I went in August. And so people are traveling. I flew into the Seattle airport. It was much busier there than it was the last time. The hotel I went to in Bellingham, Washington, was much busier than the hotel was in August. So now that's just an anecdote, but the data do show us that as people become less afraid, they are going to want to travel. And there is some belief that there is not only with what are called these durable goods like furniture, appliances, and so forth, there is a fair amount of pent up demand. Now, you can never go and make up for the lost meals that you took or the trips that you did not take, right? Those will never be recovered. But you could say, I'm going to take a longer vacation, or I'm going to go out to eat more now that I finally can, and I'm going to enjoy the restaurants that I haven't been able to go to. So I think that the outlook, at least based upon all the data I've seen and the research, is very positive that leisure and hospitality will return. It's still going to take a couple months, but it is going to return.
Great. Well, thank you for clarifying. For our next question, I'm going to read through this one verbatim, but I think it kind of touches on the point that you're making towards the end of your presentation about looking at the impacts of different policies on different groups. So this person asks, how does Fed policy, both fiscal, they say sort of more like stimulus checks, and monetary, more low interest rates, incorporate some economic factors that are relatively negative for mid to low income individuals? Factors they say that might match this criteria are CPI rises, potential inflation, housing prices, and current unemployment levels.
Yeah, that is, there is no doubt that some of the policy actions, both of the federal government and fiscal policy and monetary policy of the Federal Reserve, can have, I guess you'd call it income equality or inequality effects. So for example, with interest rates so very, very low, so somebody who buys things, this is the most wonderful thing we can have, right? You can borrow money for a house or a car or whatever at really, really low rates. But if what you do is you're a retiree on a fixed number of principal, and what you do is you invest that principal in very secure investments such as treasuries and bank accounts, you're making nothing. So clearly, the Fed is weighing those who will benefit, that's us who do the spending, versus those who have to invest in safe products. They're getting nothing, and they're going to have to actually eat into principal just to survive. So there are winners and there are losers, and this is going to have an effect upon distribution. One thing we, as economists, when you're looking, say, at the federal government and those stimulus checks, one thing that I think all economists across all the spectrum of politics would say, you always want a fiscal policy to be targeted. In other words, you want the dollars to go to the people who are most in need. And you don't want to give it to me. I never lost a single paycheck. You don't want to give it to Oprah. You don't want to give it to LeBron James. You know, that these people make lots of money. I make a good buck and I've not, lost a paycheck or something. No, those dollars need to go to the people who are hurting the most. The more targeted you can do, the more good you're doing in terms of income. If you're interested in redistribution, you're having a more of an income redistribution effect, a positive one. And those people will be able to meet their needs much more easily. So one thing I've argued is that the government at the very beginning just sent out money to anybody, And that kind of made sense because we didn't have the data necessary to figure out who was very much in need, because it looked like everybody was in need. But if we're going to go forward and we're going to decide to spend more, then we've got to focus it where the need is. And so I would think that that would give us the best thing. Now, there's also that question, I think that implicit in that question, could the government spending all this money cause inflation? And what it does is because it will expand demand faster than supply can be brought, then that would cause prices to rise. The answer is it can, if it is monetized by the debt, which it is. But we do not have evidence yet that there is a great outstripping of our ability to produce, because we can draw goods from all over the world. So if the United States is not able to produce enough of the goods we need, we can get cars from Germany or get cars from South Korea. And so when you get a supply chain which is international, that reduces the pressure on prices across the board. So we're kind of hoping that normally when the government does run very large deficits and the Federal Reserve monetizes it by printing money, that this almost always leads to inflation. It was not the case during the Great Recession, and we're hoping it will not be the case this time. And if it does begin to get out of hand, I'm confident that the Fed will be able to put on the brakes and stop that from happening.
Great. Well, thank you for, again, such a thoughtful and thorough response. Sort of on that note, something you touched on, one person asked, do you think there will be a fourth stimulus program? And have you had any, or have you heard of any conversations or have any insights to discussions surrounding that topic?
No, I've not. I think it would be very hard to get through Congress. I think there would even be some folks on the Democratic side, the Mansions of the world and so forth, who would say, wait a minute, the economy, I know that there's still a lot of unemployed. I showed you the numbers. There's no doubt that the labor market is not doing as well as, say, the economy as a whole when measured by GDP. But we are moving in the right direction. The economy is, I mean, the growth rates that we're seeing are stunningly good growth rates. And labor increases. I know that people were complaining about the 266,000 jobs in the most recent report, how it was a bad report. The only reason they concluded it was a bad report is because some economists had made a prediction it was going to be 1 million. Well, don't listen to those economists and their prediction. Those numbers, those forecasts don't mean to the American people a darn thing. All that matters, what are the numbers as actually reported? So what they did is they almost set us up for a problem by saying, oh, it's going to be 1 million. I can tell you that 266,000 is not a bad month for new jobs. It's not a bad number. I wish it were a little bit higher because there still is a labor market problem. There's still millions of Americans out of work. But that 266 was not a bad number. And so I think there will still be people in need, and we will always try to help those people. We'll provide various kinds of assistance in terms of food and housing and so forth. And that should continue because some people have long-term needs. But in terms of just throwing large quantities of money out there in the form of another stimulus package, I think that would be a mistake. And it really wouldn't be stimulus. It would be income. It would be redistribution. Because in some sense, you don't stimulate an economy that's growing 6%. You don't do that.
Great. Well, thank you again for clarifying. For our next question, one person asks, why are adjustable rates mortgages higher than fixed rate mortgages right now? They said an example being a 10-year fixed rate is 2.5% and a 10-year fixed or 10-year adjustable, pardon me, was around 4%.
Wow. I did not see those numbers. I don't know. Well, this is an opinion. This is not. And as someone who, by the way, I was just in the mortgage market, I'm purchasing myself. I would not understand why anybody would not lock in. When you have long-term rates, 30-year rates, that you have locked in at rates which are just barely above inflation, which means you're borrowing the money for nothing. Why you would not take a 30-year mortgage, lock it in, is beyond me. It has to do, now remember that when people look at their portfolio, what do they want to hold in their portfolio? It might be some car loans, some real estate, some mortgages, and so forth. It could be that simply what we're seeing right now is people simply who want to hold mortgages as part of their portfolio. They just don't want those 15-year things. They don't want them. They don't want the adjustable rate. They want the fixed rates. They want to lock in some degree of certainty. And it's a supply-demand situation. And so it is who is going to provide money at these various arrangements. And so what you look for is, where do people want to put their money right now? And I would think that and certainly as a borrower, why you would want to, all the risk is with you when you have an adjustable rate mortgage, because they will change. When you lock it in, if rates go up, you don't have to do anything. If rates go down, you just refinance. So that's an opinion statement, but so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This might be our last question based on time, but it's also a bit of a longer one. So the person asked, now that we're about over a year to our new normal or post-pandemic life, what are some of the lessons that we can learn? They say, like, mistakes we might start to see from the dramatic and like such a quick shift. For example, are there potential downsides to working remotely that some people haven't unanticipated? Again, like looking at government stimulus payments. Another question is, has the demand for delivery services like Amazon destroyed small business? Like, are there any sort of larger takeaways that you think people are discussing now as they're starting to see, or trends that they're starting to see in different areas?
Well, much of this will be opinion as opposed to, but here's what I think. I think COVID forced upon us changes in the way we do things that were going to happen anyhow, even at a place like a university. I know that we were going to be moving towards more technology and more online learning as students who can learn quite well online and have more flexibility and so forth, and learn from all over the world. They can take our classes. We knew that was coming. This kind of pushed it quicker. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's, in fact, a good thing. In terms of other activities like Amazon and so forth, I think there's actually two things going on. One, there's no doubt that having things delivered, we can actually get by with having people bring them to our house. But at the same time, we all, at least I did, I know, and others, you want to support your local businesses. So we actually see that there's two things going on. Lots of people are saying, go and support your local business. Go now to your local restaurants and so forth. So I think there's some of that going on, that people, again, realize how important it is to have your local businesses survive. It's part of the vibrancy of any economic area. And this is purely an opinion case. The reaction to this particular pandemic was unlike the reaction to any pandemic ever in American history. And I think the American people were very much willing for those first 2 weeks to say, bend the curve, give me 15 days and everything will be fine, where we closed the economy. We had never even done that before, even under something like the polio pandemic of the 50s and so forth. We never shut down. I think the one thing if there is going to be a lesson, which I hope that we learn, and that is that we can never do this again. We can never stop the American economy. What we have to do is learn to protect those who are vulnerable. And so I would like to see that part of this will force us to create a pandemic group that would then create a policy that when the next one happens, and it's going to happen, we know it's going to happen, that in fact the reaction will be one to protect the innocent, to continue economic growth, to allow those who are not in any way affected by it to continue their lives. And this is better for everybody. See, to me, the economy grows. There's not nearly as much disruption like we've had during this particular policy or this period. So I think some things have changed, and we'll go back to normal, like leisure and hospitality will. Some things will never go back. I don't think to the same. I don't think there'll be nearly as many people in offices as there used to be. And we are finding that the productivity of the workers who stay home is as high or higher than those when they were at the office, which is kind of neat. I mean, even I live way out in the northwest suburbs. I loved Metro. It's the only way to fly, as they say. It is a wonderful way to transport. But, I lost time, so to speak, because sometimes I would just drift off and watch the world go by where I wasn't working. Now I'm at home. I actually get that work done. I actually work more from home than I did. So in some sense, my productivity is higher. And I think that there's going to be some new data that come out. I'm hoping this will be the case, that the American economy, in fact, is in a better position in terms of productivity growth. Now that we've had this weird event, and it will be for the long run benefit of the entire economy. So I think that could be a very positive side effect of a very bad event.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's certainly an interesting time, and we're so appreciative of you to
Sure.
both sharing some of the data and facts as well as your expert opinion on what we're looking at over the course of the next few months and years as we all look at this new normal.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I very much enjoy, and if you wish to reach out, again, my email address is mmiller, nice and simple, at DePaul.edu, and put in the subject line, alumni presentation, and I'd be more than willing to correspond with you. I could send you other data if you want, or links to research or some of the stuff that I've looked at, and sources of data like Fred and so forth. I could help you out with stuff like that. You just let me know, and I'm here to talk about these things. So.
Awesome. Well, we are so appreciative of that, your willingness to present today, your willingness to continue these conversations, and of course, all the work that you do for our DePaul students. So on that note, we can go ahead and wrap it up. I know some people are probably hoping to get back to work or getting back to work over their lunch hour and whatnot. So thank you all again who joined us this afternoon. Thank you again, Dr. Miller, and I hope we'll see you all soon.